Abosai, we're looking at the Rambam Hilchos Talmud Torah, and every time we look at the Rambam, we see something new. In the first halacha, he discusses who's potter from the mitzvah Talmud Torah, and we have two different girsos in the Rambam. One girsa we call the Girsas Hasfarim, the way it appears in the classic printed Rambams, and there it says Uktanim. And the Rambam felt it necessary to add katan, and we'll have to see why. In the nusach of what we call kisvei yad, the manuscript Rambams, the word katanim is omitted because apparently there's no chiddush for the Rambam to write the word katanim when katanim are potter from all mitzvahs. So we'd really have to understand that text in the Rambam that has the word katanim to try to explain why there was a havamina that maybe a katan would be chayev in the mitzvah Talmud Torah. We'll come back to that in Mitzvah Shem a little bit later. And then the bulk of the Rambam in Halacha Aleph addresses two issues. Number one, who's obligated to teach this child Torah? And the Rambam quotes a pasuk to prove and establish that it's the father's chiyuv to teach his son Torah. His son is called a katan here, which means that although the katan himself is potter from Talmud Torah, but nevertheless the father has to teach him Torah. And the second dimension of the Rambam here in Halacha Aleph is noshim, to try to figure out, number one, whether a woman is obligated to study Torah, and number two, does she have to teach Torah to her children? Then we go on to Halacha Beis, and here the Rambam introduces three different concepts. Concept number one is the relationship between a grandfather and his grandson in terms of Talmud Torah. And the Rambam quotes a pasuk to prove that a grandfather has to teach his grandson Torah. Point number two in the Rambam is every chacham has to teach all the Talmidim. And the Rambam derives that from a pasuk, V'shinan tom levanecha. Point number three in the Rambam is that what happens in a situation where he could either teach Torah to his son or his grandson or somebody else's son, but he can't teach Torah to all of them. It's just impossible. And therefore we need a din of kedima to set up priorities. And the Rambam establishes that the priority order is the following. Number one, beno. Number two, ben beno. And number three, ben chavero. Which means that in a choice between his son and his grandson, he'll choose his son. In a choice between his son or his grandson on the one hand and somebody else's son on the other hand, then his lineage, his offspring come first, and that's kedima. Now the next point in the Rambam is either here in Halacha Beis or possibly in Halacha Gimel, and this becomes an issue amongst the various, shall we say, girsos in the Rambam. There's one girsa that has Halacha Gimel beginning with the case of having to pay and hire a malamed and pay out of pocket for that malamed to teach his son Torah. And that's the beginning of Halacha Gimel. Another text has it as the end of Halacha Beis. Now let's try to understand what would be the logical push to integrate the end, to integrate this concept of paying for his son's education into Halacha Beis as opposed to beginning of another Halacha. And in order to answer that, we have to ask another question. And this is a question that the Rambam himself asks in Halacha Beis. He raises the following issue. Since we derive from V'shinantam levanecha that you have to teach your sons your friend's son's Torah, ben chavero, kol talmidim, whether you're related to you or not, why did the Torah then have to go out of its way to obligate the father to teach his son? I mean, his son is included under the general category of kol talmidim. His son is not worse than any other Talmud. And the first answer the Rambam gives to that question is that by establishing a separate chiyuv on the father to teach his son, we have what's called kedima, so that the Torah took the son out of the whole pot of kol talmidim and set up the son as a separate chiyuv, and that puts the chiyuv of the father vis-a-vis his son on a higher level, and it becomes it takes precedence to teaching someone else's son Torah. Then the Rambam gives another answer, according to that text that integrates schar, meaning paying tuition, into halacha beis. And the second answer of the Rambam is that the Torah went out of its way to obligate the father to teach his son Torah in order to establish a monetary obligation to pay out of his bank account for the education of his son. That does not apply to ben chavero. So then the Rambam is giving two answers to the same question, and they all belong to the same halacha. The question that the Rambam raises, why did the Torah go out of its way to obligate the father to teach his son, if in any event he has to teach his son the same way he has to teach all the Talmidim, even ben chavero? And the Rambam offers two answers to that question. One is by upgrading the obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son above and beyond all the Talmidim. He now has a din kedima in a case where he can't do both, and he has to choose one or the other, and he's going to choose to teach his son rather than his friend's son. And the second answer of the Rambam is that by upgrading the obligation of the father vis-a-vis his son, the monetary obligation kicks in, which means that the father is now obligated to pay tuition for his son. He doesn't have to pay tuition for teaching ben chavero. Okay. Now, let's for one moment focus on the issue of kedima. The Rambam has kedima in the following scenarios: ben versus ben haben, and that's one din of kedima. The second din of kedima is ben or ben haben on the one hand, and ben chavero on the other hand. What the Rambam seems to have omitted here is a fundamental issue, and that is, what's the kedima in terms of teaching himself Torah, meaning the father is obligated to study Torah on his own, versus teaching his son's Torah? Meaning, this issue could come up in two different ways. Number one, in a financial sense, let's say he only has money to hire someone to teach himself or his son. He can't hire two different malamdim. And bechinam, even if he's not hiring anybody, so it's not an issue of who, should get the paycheck and who would be paid to teach whom, but rather he has to give himself over to his own study of Torah. Let's say he's on a much higher level than his young son, or he has to give up on his own Torah, put that on the back burners, so to speak, for the sake of teaching his son Torah. And the Rambam seems to have omitted this. However, let's fast forward to Halacha Daled for a moment. And the Rambam there says the following: Hayahu rotza lilmod Torah. The father himself wants to study Torah. V'yeshlo ben lilmod Torah. But he has a son who has to study Torah. Hu kodem libno. So here the Rambam has introduced the law of kedima. he seems to have omitted it in Halacha Beis Liel when he really addresses the issue of Kedima, but he sort of woke up out of a dream and reminded himself that, hey, I forgot to address the following issue of Kedima. And moreover, what's a bit strange about the Rambam is that he says, Hu konam libno, without quoting a pasuk. Now, in the other case of Kedima, the Rambam quotes psukim. He says that V'limadetem osam es b'nechem gives Kedima to his son, Vodatem levanecha lebnei banecha gives Kedima to his grandson. But with regard to himself, he never quotes any pasuk. And here I want to press a button. Whenever I say the word press a button, I mean a methodological point that applies all over the Rambam, and that is that if the Rambam doesn't quote a source or a pasuk, it means it's a svara. So apparently there was a svara pshuta that he should come before his ben. And the one who really tackles this head on is a man by the name of Rav Yechezkel Sarna, Zichrono Livracha, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Chevron Yeshiva here in Eretz Yisrael, who's gone already probably 30, 40 years. And Rav Yechezkel Sarna says a fascinating point. He says that the Rambam didn't feel compelled to quote a pasuk in Halacha Daled as far as Kedim is concerned, meaning that he, the father, comes before his son, for the following reason. We have a rule in Halacha of Kedima that goes way beyond the Daled Amos, the purview of Talmud Torah. And that rule is formulated by Rabbi Akiva in a Gemara Bava Metzia, very famous Gemara, and it's called Chayecha Kodmin. Again, the word Kedima. So if you have to save your own life or save someone else's life, and you can't save both yourself and someone else, then you save your own life. That's called Chayecha Kodmin. And in fact, Rabbi Akiva derives that from a pasuk. Says Rabbi Cheskel Sarna, that halach of Kedima is so fundamental that it applies logically, without any pasuk, to Talmud Torah. And the father will daiga, he'll have to worry about his own Talmud Torah first, and give it top priority over worrying about anyone else's Torah, including his own son, under the principle of Chayecha Kodin. Joe?
I'm sorry, just when it says Limud Torah, is there levels in which we can differentiate with regards to all of these, these different, kodmim? In other words, when the Rambam says Limud Torah, is he saying on a fundamental level, or is he talking about on a higher level? Like, if they both need to get the fundamentals of it, they're just learning to begin with, then maybe he's saying he needs to have a foundation just like his son. But
so Joe, you're raising a general question, a very important question about Kedima, but I'm not up to that yet, meaning that's a question that I have to put off for the time being.
Okay.
Because right now, I just want to exhaust this point about Rabbi Cheskel Sarna. And I want to question whether or not Rabbi Cheskel Sarna's underlying premise is necessarily correct. Meaning, in Rav Sarna's perspective, if there's a halach of Chayecha Kodmin, which generates a halach of Kedima in Pikuach Nefesh, when we're dealing with life and death, and yet there's kedima, and chayecha kodmin, so you give kedima to yourself, and you have to save yourself, then in Talmud Torah, for sure, you're going to give yourself kedima. That's the premise of Rav Sarna, and therefore in Halacha Dalid, there's no need to quote a pasuk. Chayecha Kodmin is a universal principle. Like, for example, let's say you only have enough money to support yourself, or you could give it over to somebody else, then you'll take it for yourself. And in Pikuach Nefesh, we have Rabbi Akiva Chayecha Kodmin. So let's just apply it to Talmud Torah. And your Torah comes first. I don't need a pasuk for that. I'm just applying a universal rule to a specific case. I can apply it to many different cases. There could be untold numbers of scenarios in which it's a question of me, do I have to worry about myself or somebody else? And we're going to always apply the general universal principle of Chayecha Kodmin. And it applies here as well. Now, Joe is asking about the specifics. What about if this guy needs fundamentals? This guy needs something more advanced, or this one is more developed, and this one has a higher level. There are many, many questions you could ask here, and they're all valid and have to be addressed. But I just wanted to focus our attention on this, because the plot grows thicker. And Rav Yecheskel Sarna, based on this interpretation of the Rambam, comes to a very far-reaching conclusion beyond the confines of Talmud Torah. Listen carefully. Let's say you have to choose between your son and someone else's son in a pikuach nefesh situation. Is there a halach of kedima for your son? Now, again, I'm going to put my, how should I say, on the table. I'm going to put all my ignorance. I don't know that anyone ever addressed this question. So until you gentlemen tell me that maybe flip it through AI or somebody chat, whatever they call it, and you come up with a source for this, I'm going to plead the fifth. I'm going to plead ignorance. I don't know that anyone ever came up with this question. So again, here's the question. It's a life-saving situation. Just two people fell off the ship and they're drowning. Chas v'shalom. You have one lifesaver. Those round things. I don't know what they're called. And you can either throw it towards your son or throw it towards Yenam's son, somebody else's son. Are there any specific halachas here? According to Rabbi Cheskel Sarno, listen carefully, there's no kedima over here. And listen to the way he proves this. He says the following, that if there was a halach of kedima in chayecha kodmin pikuach nefesh, to save your son before you save someone else's son, then why does the Rambam need a pasuk of limadetem osam es b'nechem in halacha beis to establish that you have to teach your son before you teach your friend's son? Says Rabbi Cheskel, and again, I worked on this very hard because his language is so terse. What I'm telling you over, which will take me 20 minutes, he wrote in one line. But the way I understand it, he's saying the following, that if the Rambam understood that there's no need for a pasuk to establish kedima for yourself over anyone else, and it just simply fits into the universal category of chayecha kodmin, why then does the Rambam feel compelled to quote a pasuk in order to derive, and according to the Rambam, that's the whole point of this pasuk, in order to derive the halach of kedima of your son over your friend's son, why does Rambam need a pasuk for that? Why not just simply apply the universal principle of chayecha kodman? I mean, it works in the case of yourself vis-a-vis anyone else, including your son, and you give yourself precedence, save yourself first, and teach yourself Torah first. That application to Talmud Torah is nothing more than applying a universal principle to a specific case. And if that be the case, then why not apply chayecha kodman to the Talmud Torah case of either teaching your son or ben chavero? And the answer is because Talmud Torah operates within its own realm, and there is no chayecha kodman versus when it's your son versus someone else's son. So imagine Rabbi Yecheskel Sarna is paskening on a life and death issue. Are you listening to me, Rabbosai? I get very excited about this. He's paskening on a life and death issue based on a diuk in Hilchos Talmud Torah Perek Aleph Halacha Beis. Why does the Rambam need a pasuk to establish that you teach your son Torah and you forfeit teaching somebody else's son Torah? Why does Rambam need a pasuk for that? The Rambam works very hard to justify the pasuk, and he says we justify the pasuk because we need it to set up a kedima of beno before ben chavera. Says Rabbi Cheskel Sarna, what does the Rambam need that for? Why not just simply apply the principle of chayecha kodman? And the answer has to be, says Rabbi Cheskel, that there is no chayecha kodman. That when it comes to saving either your son's life or someone else's son's life, there's no chayecha kodman. They're all equal in the eyes of the Almighty. So that chayecha kodman applies when it's yourself, but that's it. And here in Talmud Torah, I'm just going to simply apply the halach of chayecha kodman, and you'll use all your resources, your time, your money, your body, and everything for yourself in Talmud Torah before you have enough for anybody else, including your son, because chayecha kodman. And the Rambam doesn't even need a pasuk for that. He doesn't even blink an eyelash because he's just simply applying a universal principle to the specific mitzvah, the specific case of Talmud Torah. But yet, in the issue of son versus somebody else's son in Torah, the Rambam doesn't know what to do. He doesn't have chayecha kodman. He is forced to derive that from a pasuk. And he says that's the whole point of this pasuk. Why did the Torah ask the Rambam to add a chiyuv for the father vis-a-vis his son? After all, even if it wasn't his son, he'd have to teach him Torah under Vishinat Luvanecha. So why did the Torah command the father? The answer is to give the son kedima over ben chavera. Why not just simply apply chayecha kodman? And based on this, Rabbi Cheskel Sarna comes to the conclusion that there is no chayecha kodman. And that principle would not give me any insight as to who I should teach Torah first, my son or your son. And the only reason I'm going to give my son kedima and forfeit your son is only because of the pasuk li'madatem oso mismenecha, but not because of chayecha kodman. There is no chayecha kodman. Now again, if there's no chayecha kodman, then you have to go through a whole sugya in Masechta. Where is it? Horios, I believe. Check me out on this, Bob. Where's the famous sugya of what's it called? Triage, we call it. You know what I mean? Who comes first? You know, you can only save one person, or in Pidyon Shvuyim, you only have enough money to redeem so-and-so. Who comes first? The Kohen before a Levi, and so forth and so on, and all the rules and regulations. And you'll apply those rules and, you know, those guidelines to the case of your son versus somebody else's son. There's no chayecha kodman. Which, again, intuitively I could agree with him. Maybe there shouldn't be chayecha kodman in a matter of life and death just because he's my son. Again, that doesn't sound very emotional, but in terms of cold legal concepts, I mean, so it's your son, so what? But how do I know this? And somebody might come forward and say, well, you know, Bino kara davua ninu, the son is an extension of his father. Therefore, you have to save your son as if you were saving yourself. Chayecha kodmin, chaye banecha kodmin, and choose your son and save him over somebody else's son. But comes along the Rosh Yeshiva, and he says that I know the answer to this question based on my interpretation of the Rambam Hilchos Talmud Torah. Doesn't that, again, I don't know if that excites you, but, to use a colloquial phrase, it blows my mind. It just, mamish, it's hard for me to believe it. It's just wild. I'm learning Hilchos Talmud Torah in the Rambam, and I'm deriving conclusions in life and death choice situations, most difficult moral situations. Bobby?
What about if you have a responsibility to support your son, which you don't have for chayecha chavercha, for ben chavercha? So you have to support. You have to, like, you have a responsibility to sustain him. Doesn't that also mean that if he's dying, you have to help save him? Like, wouldn't that?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I think that the halacha of supporting one's son is probably a takonis chachamim. I don't know that it's doraisa. I don't know of a source for it. In fact, the poskim wonder whether you could subtract from meiser ksafim the monies that you give to support your son. And they differentiate between a son who's less than 6 years old and a boy who's more than 6 years old, whatever it is. But again, even if I would grant you that there was a doraisa halacha that I have to support my son financially, I don't know if in life and death matters that, who's going to live and who's going to die. I don't know if the halacha would go that far and say, well, he's your son, you have to support him, therefore you have to save him and let somebody else's die. Meaning, if you're talking about an obligation to support your son and sustain him, okay, that's fine. But it's not at anyone else's. No one's dying out there because you are supporting your son. But if somebody else is dying because you have this one lifesaver and you could only give it to your son, and therefore he's going to perish, I don't know. I can't derive any conclusions from a monetary obligation to that of life and death. So we're now closing what I call Hakafa Aleph, or we could call it Roman numeral number 1. And I want to go on to Roman numeral number 2, which is another piece in Rabbi Cheskel Sarna, and see if I can compare the two. Are you ready for this? Let's take a look at Halacha Gimel, which we skipped. We'll go back to Halacha Gimel. How are we doing on the clock? We have time? Mishalo limdo aviv. Chayev l'lamed es atzmo. Now, I'm stopping for a moment, pausing in the middle of a sentence. The father is obligated to teach his son Torah. That we've established both in Halacha Aleph and in Halacha Beis. Now in Halacha Gimel, the father did not fulfill his obligation. Let's say he died. Let's say he was on the other side of the globe. He was very ill. He was in Amoritz. Whatever it is, you'll come up with any number of scenarios where the father did not teach his son Torah. Says the Rambam, we're not going to leave the son out in the cold without Torah. So the son now picks up his father's obligation, and look at the language of the Rambam, Chayav l'lamed es atzmo. He now becomes a teacher to teach himself. Now, the big issue in this Rambam, which is not Rabbi Cheskel Sarna's issue, is at what age does this young lad become obligated to teach himself Torah? That's a gigantic issue, and if we have time, I would address it, or maybe talk about it another time, because the Rambam's language is kishe yakir. We don't know what that means. Nobody knows what the Rambam means by kishe yakir. But now the Rambam quotes a pasuk. And we always press the button when the Rambam quotes a pasuk. It means it's not svara, it's doraisa, and it has to be derived from a pasuk. Shenemar. Now watch the pasuk. V'limadatem. No, I should read it right. Ulemadatem osam ushmartem lasosam. Now watch what happens over here. The Rambam interprets the beginning of the pasuk based on the end of the pasuk. What you might call Seifa Dekra, Megala al Reisha Dekra. What does it say in this pasuk? It says, Ulamadatem Osam. Study them, study the Torah. And there's no mention of the ben, no mention of the father. Apparently, this is a universal obligation to study the Torah. But then the pasuk, as the Rambam points out, adds another two words, seemingly defining the purpose of studying Torah, and that's ushmartem lasosam, so you can observe the law of the Torah. You know, right away I'm reminded of the statement in Chazal, Ein amoretz chassid, meaning you can't observe the Torah if you don't know the Torah. And therefore, ushmartem lasosam, at the end of this pasuk, reveals or sheds light on the beginning of the pasuk, ulamadatem osam, because ushmartem lasosam. And that applies to every Jew. So that even if your father didn't teach you Torah, well, ushmartem lasosam, therefore ulamadatem osam. You have to teach yourself Torah. And the Rambam goes on to dramatize it, so to speak, and he says that ha-Talmud kodem l'maisa, right? You can't do the maisa without Talmud. And a Talmud maybe the day maisa, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to present to you the analysis of Reb Chaim Sarna on this Rambam, Halacha Gimel, in my own words. Again, I'm doing a lot of detective work. As I told you, he says a velt in one line. So if he didn't say it, then Berzon is saying it. But no, I really believe that this is what he meant. But keep in mind, my ultimate goal is to go back to the other insight of Rabbi Cheskel Sarda regarding whether you save your son first or somebody else's son. Okay. So again, I'm going to present it to you with an introduction that doesn't appear at all in Rabbi Cheskel Sarda, but this is what I think he has in mind. We have a principle called mitzvos tzrichos kavana. Now, what normally, if we paskin, which I don't know if we do, but let's say we paskin mitzvos tzrichos kavana, it means kavana l'shem mitzvah. Comes along Rav Sarna. Again, I'm formulating it in my language. And he says there's a separate halacha of kavana, a separate requirement of kavana in the study of Torah, which is written here in this pasuk, the way the Rambam derives conclusions from this pasuk. Above and beyond kavana l'shem mitzvah, meaning I'm studying Torah because the Torah commanded me to study Torah, like I put on tzitzis because the Torah commanded me to put on tzitzis, and I eat matzah because the Torah commanded me. That's called mitzvahs tzrichas kavana. There's another halacha that's unique to Talmud Torah and requires a separate kavana. And what is that kavana? L'shem kiyum kol mitzvos. Meaning, it's not enough to study Torah. I have to study Torah for the purpose of fulfilling the Torah, of observing the Torah. And Rav Sarna goes very far with this, He says that if you don't have kavana in your study of Torah for the sake of fulfilling the Torah and observing its mitzvahs, then you blew it. You did not fulfill this mitzvah, because the mitzvah is ulamadatem osam ushmartem lasosam. So if Sarna is adding another dimension to this pasuk, which is not totally explicit in the Rambam, namely that ushmartem lasosam will tell you what kavanah you have to have on ulamadatem osam. Namely, that your kavanah has to be l'shem asiyas hamitzvos. Now he says the following. Listen to this. And again, I'm embellishing it in my language, and I hope this is what he meant. You can be responsible to have that kavanah. You could be held accountable and required to have the kavanah of studying Torah for the purpose of doing mitzvahs. Granted, something I can impose that obligation upon you. But you cannot be obligated to expect, that's a bad word, but maybe I'll polish it up a little better, your son to be studying Torah for the purpose of doing mitzvahs. Your obligation to teach your son Torah comes under a different pasuk. It's not derived from this pasuk. The Rambam already has a pasuk l'madatem osam es b'neicha in halacha beis, in halacha aleph and beis. The pasuk doesn't indicate anything about shmiras hamitzvos. The pasuk doesn't indicate that your son is learning Torah for the purpose of asiyas hamitzvos. And therefore, the responsibility of your father has nothing to do with the son's intention of asiyas mitzvos. So you, as a father, you don't have to go into the mindset of the son, do some sort of a probe, into his son, into the mind of your son. You teach your son Torah. He'll learn Torah, and that's it. What kavanah he has, meaning your son, that's not your business. That's out of your realm. If you're with me so far, I'm about to drop a bomb, and this is Rabbi Cheskel Sarna's bomb, not mine. Rabbi Cheskel Sarna says that the reason you have to teach yourself Torah before your son is because your Torah is fundamentally, essentially different than your son's Torah. Your Torah is Almanas Lilmod. Your son's Torah is not Almanas Lilmod. It doesn't have to be, It'd be great if it was, but that's not part of the deal here. That's not part of the responsibility or the obligation. Says Rabbi Cheskel Sarna that indicates a new level of chayecha kodmin. Remember, we said that if it's a choice between yourself and your son, the Rambam doesn't even quote a pasuk as that. And therefore, the Rambam Halacha Dalet says, "Hayahu rotza lilmod Torah v'yesh lo ben lilmod Torah hu kodem livno," and the Rambam doesn't quote a pasuk. Says Rav Sarna, if you recall, that's because it's a logical derivation from a universal principle called chayecha kodmin. And now Rav Yechezkel wants to say the following, that what's the nature of the chayecha kodmin is because your Talmud Torah is fundamentally different than your son's Talmud Torah. Now, if that be the case, then when it comes to Beno and Ben Chavero, who gets Kedima back in Halacha Beis, I understand very well why Chayecha Kodmin doesn't apply. The reason why Chayecha Kodmin can't apply is because both your son and your friend's son have the same exact identical Talmud Torah, which is Limud without Almanas Lasos. So if you're choosing between your son and your friend's son, and there's no application of Chayecha Kodmin because there's no essential difference between the Talmud Torah of your son and the Talmud Torah of your friend's son, then how do you know that you give Kedima to your son? And for that, the Rambam needs a pasuk. So let's go over now the original statement of Rabbi Yechezkel Sarna. He wanted to derive a conclusion in life and death from the fact that the Rambam needed a pasuk. Because why didn't the Rambam apply the principle of Chayecha Kodmin? The answer is now Pashut. Chayecha Kodmin would not apply over here. Because Chayecha Kodmin only applies because the father's Torah vis-a-vis himself is on a higher level. It's essentially a different kind of Torah. It's the Torah al-Manas Lilmod. I'm sorry, Torah al-Manas Lasos. And Torah al-Manas Lasos is Kihem Chayenu v'Yorach Yameinu. Like we say, again, I'm just adding a little bit of my own embellishment, like in Birchas Kriyat Shema, right? I don't have a siddur in front of me, but take a look in the last bracha before Kriyat Shema in the morning, right? We say, if anybody has a siddur, open it up, but you'll see there that we emphasize the Kiyum mitzvahs, right? Lilmod, Lamed, Lishmar Velasos, etc., etc. But it's more than that. You have a siddur?
I don't have a siddur, but the Lishmar Velasos is called the Talmud Torah Secha. I mean, I have them.
And what comes next?
Uh,
I'll get a siddur here. 1 second. Yeah, there it is. Lishmar v'lasos l'kayim is called divrei Talmud Torah Secha v'yav. And by the way, in halacha, if you have a suffix, whether or not you recited Birchas HaTorah in the morning, then you can be yotze with this bracha. This bracha is a Birchas HaTorah, because Kriyat Shema is also Torah. And it says explicitly that same b'libenu blah, 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 lilmod Torah, right? Lishmar v'lasos u'lekayim. So according to Rabbi Yechezkel Sarna, that's essential to the mitzvah Talmud Torah. And that's called Kihem Chayenu v'Yorach Yameinu. That's the chiyus. You know, why does this give me life? Because I can fulfill the Torah. Talmud Torah, as great as it is, cannot give me life if I'm not interested in being Mekayim the mitzvahs. But once Gadol Talmud Amevili De Maisa, which is the Rambam's language here in Halacha Daled, then the study of Torah becomes Kihem Chayenu. And then it fits into the category of Pikuach Nefesh. And therefore the Rambam doesn't even have to quote a pasuk to prove that you come before your own son. Right? Who wrote Silabo Torah? Beno wrote Silabo Torah. Who could live? No. Why does he come before Beno? Because Kihem Chayenu, his Torah is the Torah of mitzvos. As the pasuk says, Ulumadatem osam, ushmartem lasosam. Whereas his son's Torah, as you are obligated as a father to teach him Torah, has nothing to do with Almanas Lasos. So it doesn't come under Chayecha Kodmin. And if that be the case, then your son's Torah and your friend's son's Torah, Ben Chavero, are equal. And neither of them come under Chayecha Kodmin. Is Memela, that's why the Rambam needs a pasuk in Halacha Beis to establish Kedimas Beno al Ben Beno, And he couldn't apply the principle of Chayecha Kodman because Chayecha Kodman is not applicable here. He needs a pasuk to establish Kedima. But don't derive any conclusions about life and death. It could very well be that as far as life and death issues is concerned, Chaye bincha Kodmim leChaye ben chavercha. It's very possible. So as in what I called Hakafa Aleph, Rabbi Yechezkel Sarna derived the conclusion that your son and your friend's son are absolutely equal, and it has to be like that. And how did he prove it? Because otherwise, why did the Rambam need for Limaditim Osam Esbenechem to establish Kedima and Talmud Torah? Why didn't he just apply the principle of Chayecha Kodmin? That now falls by the wayside. Because in light of Halacha Daled, we come to the conclusion that Chayecha Kodmin only applies to your own Torah, which is Almanas Lasos. Whoa. All that I gave you today in about, I don't know, a half hour, 40 minutes, whatever it was, is based on like 2 lines in Reb Chezkel Sarna, which probably notes that he wrote on his own notebook. I don't know the history of it. I doubt if he wrote this for the purpose of publishing, because it's so sketchy. It doesn't make sense for a Shiva to write something that's so sketchy.
Again, I'm sorry. Why do you say for his ben it's not lasos?
Because that's way beyond the purview of my responsibility. The Torah says limanitem. The Torah doesn't say limanitem osam ismnechem lishmar lasoso. That pasuk doesn't exist. Torah says limanitem osam ismnechem. I can enter into my son's mindset and know whether he has this kavanah or not. The Torah commands me on actions, not on forcing someone to have kavanah.
On actions.
So again, Joe, you can. I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll just read you, his language, and then we'll have to stop because my family's waiting for me in the park over here. We have a holiday today. It's Canada Day here in Israel. I don't know if you say Tachnun on Canada Day. I'm not sure.
But it's way more than Canada Day.
So I davened in a minyan that said Tachnun, but honestly, I think this year, we should all drop Tachnun at least. I don't know, this year, I feel like a Zionist this year. I mean, after all that we've been going through, I don't know.
We had Hallel this morning.
Okay, good. I should get myself over to 22 Pinsker. Okay, but here's what I want to read to you. He says the following. He says, Nira, Shehain, he's referring to the father's own personal obligation and his obligation to teach his son. Hein shtei mitzvahs aseh. Right, they're 2 different mitzvahs. I would add here, because they're derived from 2 different psukim. Talmud Torah shel atzmo, hu dafka al manas lasos. Masha enkein Talmud Torah shel beno, ein geder ha-mitzvah. We don't define the father's obligation dafka sheyeh batuach bibno, that he has to be guaranteed that his son lomed al manas lasos. That's already, again, I'm adding my own flavor to it. That's already out of your orbit. I don't know that I can guarantee that. Again, there's another obligation of chinuch l'mitzvahs. I'm not saying that there's I have to make sure that my son does mitzvahs, but that has nothing to do with Talmud Torah. That's a separate obligation called chinuch. And then he goes on to say, Al pizei yishlomer de mihai time bi atzmo amrin chayecha kodmin avalo b'bno. We don't apply the principle of chayecha kodmin to b'no. Mishum she'ein geder chayecha ela b'almanas lasos. He's very terse, very short. Okay, Rabbosai, we'll stop here and hopefully we'll hear good news.
Okay. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you very much as well.
I'm not sure if I would say Chag Sameach that far. I'm not sure. The word Chag has to do with a korban.
Yeah.
So I don't know, even if, let's say, I agree that this is Reishis Tzmichas Gulasenu, which I'm hoping it is, but I don't know. I think Reishis Tzmichas Gulasenu is a tefillah. It's not a statement or a declaration. But anyway, what I wanted to suggest is that I don't think that if the Mashiach would come today, we would definitely bring a Karban Chagiga. I don't think so. Okay, everyone.